At the height of its power, Rome seemed invincible. Its legions crossed continents like red-hot blades, crushing kingdoms, subjugating cultures, absorbing everything in their path. Every decade, a new name appeared on the maps of the Senate as a Roman province. Gaul fell, Egypt was annexed, Judea surrendered, Dia went down in history. Everything fit into the expansionist logic of an empire that knew no borders, or almost. In northern Britain, however, there was an exception. A mountainous territory shrouded in mist, where the forests seemed to watch in silence and the winds cut like blades. Colonia, what we now know as Scotland. But what was there that managed to stop the greatest empire of antiquity? Today, you will learn about the land that Rome never managed to conquer. From its beginnings, Rome never saw war solely as a defensive necessity. For the Romans, waging war was a legitimate way to assert power, project prestige, and expand civilization. Conquering meant more than dominating lands. It meant imposing order on a world seen as chaotic. That is why each new province was celebrated as a moral victory, as if the universe itself were surrendering to Roman reason. During the Republic, this logic was already in place, but it was during the Empire that it intensified as a doctrine. Under Caesar, Gaul was crushed. Under Octavian, Egypt was absorbed and Hispania consolidated. In Asia, even the Parthians, one of Rome's greatest historical enemies, were contained within well-defined borders. And in the West, what seemed to be the edge of the known world, the island of Britannia, was also swallowed up by the imperial machine. In the year 43 AD, Emperor Claudius launched an ambitious campaign in Britain with the support of local elites, the skillful use of diplomacy, and an overwhelming military force. The Romans took the south of the island with surprising speed. Entire tribes were co-opted. Local leaders were granted citizenship in official positions. Within a few decades, southern Britain already boasted amphitheaters, paved roads, and even public baths. For the Romans, it seemed like another inevitable success. And then their eyes turned northward. Colonia was seen as just another stage, just a mountainous terrain to overcome, a technical obstacle, not a strategic one. The peoples who lived there were considered primitive, tribal, without writing, without large-scale agriculture, without a central political organization. Rome saw them as savages who had not yet understood the benefits of being conquered. Called Julius Auricula, governor of Britain and father-in-law of the historian Tacitus, was one of the first to lead campaigns to the north. In his biography written by Tacitus, we clearly see the Roman mentality. The Caledonians were described as tough brutes, yes, but backward, and therefore inevitably surmountable. Rome believed that time and force would be enough to bring them to their senses. But that confidence hit a fatal blindness, because Rome knew how to deal with enemy armies. It knew how to negotiate with local elites. It knew how to subdue cities and cut off supplies. But it did not know what to do when the enemy had no king, no capital, and wanted absolutely nothing from Rome. The moment the legions crossed the threshold of Colonia, everything began to go wrong. Colonia was made of rocks and silence, a landscape shaped to slowly destroy any force that dared to caress it. The mountains of the Great Plains rose like natural walls cut by narrow valleys, treacherous swamps, and forests so dense that light barely touched the ground. The Great Caledonian Forest, a mass of ancient vegetation, was impenetrable, dark, and full of invisible traps. The peat bogs swallowed feet, horses, and even entire carts, deep lakes. The locks emerged like black wounds in the landscape and the ground, always damp, slippery, unstable. The rain seemed endless. Thick fogs arose out of nowhere, blocking visibility to within a few meters. The legionnaires marched without knowing if the road ahead was safe or would lead them straight to a precipice. Even in the camps, the humidity was relentless. Rotting provisions, corroding armor, spreading disease. Medical accounts from the time mentioned the increase in dysentery, lung infections, and mysterious fevers among the troops in northern Britannia. Diseases that did not kill in combat, but slowly wore down the morale of any army. Roman strategy developed over centuries depended on order. Calculated marches, symmetrical camps, well-planned roads, constant supply lines. It was a machine, but machines break down when the terrain refuses to cooperate. In Colonia, no road remained intact for long. No convoy could advance without risk. No map was reliable, and every tree, every hill, every bend could hide the next disaster. Visibility was so unstable that scouts got lost. Entire patrols disappeared. Archaeological research and climatological studies confirm that the climate in Scotland during the Roman period was in many ways even harsher than it is today. Long winters, short summers, and constant humidity turned the campaign into a war against the environment itself. The Romans were prepared to face human armies, but in Colonia, their greatest enemy was the ground beneath their feet, followed by the ghosts that slipped through the fog and used nature as their own weapon. They appeared as shadows on the hills, painted bodies, faces hidden by the mist, eyes as alert as those of predators. The Romans called them picti, the painted ones, not because they knew their language or culture, but because they saw their skin marked with blue lines, mystical drawings, tribal symbols, probably made with wad, a local plant with intense coloring. It was the only possible visual record of a people who left no writings and built no cities. The Picts were not a unified nation, but rather dozens of tribes and clans scattered among mountains, valleys, and forests, each with its own leader, culture, and way of surviving in one of the most hostile environments in Europe. The absence of a central government, which the Romans saw as a sign of weakness, was in fact a weapon because there was no single point to conquer. Each tribe was ahead of the Aoi, same snake. Cutting off one did not prevent the others from continuing to bite. They lived in circular stone structures called brocks in isolated villages, almost always built in elevated places, difficult to access with a strategic view of the surroundings. They knew where to tread, where to escape, where to ambush. They navigated between rivers and lakes, and light silent boats using paths invisible to Roman eyes. And when pursued, they disappeared among the trees as if they were part of them. The most impressive thing is that they resisted not only with spears and tactics, they resisted with an idea that they did not need Rome, they did not want citizenship, they did not want roads, they did not want to dress like Romans or speak like them. They rejected the imperial model from within, and that disarmed one of Rome's greatest weapons, its ability to absorb. Throughout its history, Rome transformed enemies into allies, co-opted elites, promoted the children of barbarian kings, offered positions, status, citizenship. It helped create Romans outside Rome. But the Picts did not want that gift. They did not seek advancement or recognition. They were at home, and anyone who crossed those hills armed would be treated as an invader and eliminated. Tacitus, in describing the Caledonians, the direct ancestors of the Picts, highlights a phrase that sums up the spirit of those tribes. They are more prepared for war than for submission. It was not just a matter of pride, it was a system of survival. The more Rome attacked, the more the Pictish tribes scattered. The more Rome built, the more they demolished. It was a resistance that could not be suppressed with conventional victories because it did not come from castles or senates, but from the land, the forest, and their refusal to kneel. And it was exactly that way of thinking that gave rise to a completely different way of fighting. Rome's greatest strength always lay in predictability, organized formations, clear orders, constant advance. The legions were like mobile walls designed to crush the enemy with discipline and weight. And that worked when the enemy appeared. But the Picts did not appear. Not open country, not at the appointed time, not on Rome's terms. The war that the Picts imposed was not fought with great battles, but with silence. Ambushes in dense forests, nighttime attacks on sleeping camps, patrols that disappeared without a trace. It was a war that began when the Romans believed the path was clear and ended with arrows flying out of the fog, spears emerging from the undergrowth, stones rolling down the slopes. The Romans were not prepared for that. Each soldier marched with dozens of pounds of equipment, shield, gladius, armor, rations, tools, all made for conventional combat. In contrast, the Picts moved lightly, carried little, attacked quickly, retreated before the response arrived, and disappeared back into the landscape. Tacitus describes this pattern when narrating the famous Battle of Mount Grappius. According to him, The Caledonians appeared like ghosts in the hills, fought fiercely, and then disappeared. Even with the Roman victory in that confrontation, with Agricola claiming to have killed thousands of enemies, the actual result was insignificant. There was no occupation or control because there was no central structure to control. The survivors simply withdrew, demobilized, and reappeared weeks later at another location. It was like fighting smoke. Each Pictish attack sought to destabilize the Roman routine. They cut off supply routes, interrupted messengers, spread fear, and made the Romans sleep with their hands on their weapons. And when a legion finally reacted, the enemy was no longer there. Sometimes they left only footprints, sometimes not even that. This war of attrition did not destroy entire armies, but it destroyed morale. And Rome knew the weight of that. A legionnaire without sleep, without food, and in constant fear became a less effective soldier. A commander under pressure from invisible attacks made wrong decisions. It was a war to survive day by day, and the Picts knew how to wait. They were in no hurry. They had no territories to defend, only a principle to resist. When brute force failed, Rome resorted to what had always worked elsewhere in the world: control through terror. It was an ancient formula, cruel but effective. Destroy crops, block resources, take hostages, raze entire villages. That had worked in Gaul, in Judea, in Germania. Entire peoples bowed down before the systematic devastation of the legions. But in Colonia, that logic broke down because there was nothing to destroy. The Picts did not live in walled cities, did not depend on centralized crops, did not use supply warehouses, lived in small mobile communities scattered across vast mountainous areas. They hunted, fished, gathered. When danger approached, they simply disappeared. Their villages could be evacuated in a matter of hours. And Rome, which always knew how to dominate people through their stomachs, found there an enemy that did not feel hunger in the same way. Even so, the generals tried. They fortified strategic areas, built fortified camps and outposts. One of the most notable was in Chutil, a huge fort in the heart of Colonia, with the capacity to house thousands of soldiers. There, more than 750,000 iron nails were found buried, hidden, or discarded before the evacuation, so that they would not fall into enemy hands. The fort was abandoned before it was even completed. Archaeological records show this pattern: construction, attempted occupation, and then abandonment. The campaigns advanced but left no roots. No Romanized villages or permanent roads emerged. Only footprints that would soon be erased by the rain. The frontier advanced and retreated like an unstable line drawn in the sand. Attempts to control it became increasingly costly. Each soldier demanded supplies that came from the south: wheat, wine, oil, equipment. But the further north they advanced, the more difficult transportation became. The Roman roads, the pride of the empire, could not overcome the geography of Colonia without immense cost. Convoys were slow, vulnerable, and constant targets of attacks. Roman sources report that reinforcements had to be sent frequently, but even with new troops, Pictish attacks continued, often in areas considered pacified. What the Romans called peace was nothing more than a temporary truce before the next ambush. Scholars such as Peter Sowe and Shepherd Freder make this clear. The Roman presence north of Hadrian's Wall was never real in terms of domination. It was a tense or ephemeral presence of constant resistance, and worst of all, a presence that drained resources, men, and morale. Rome then began to wonder if that land was worth so much effort. Behind every conquest, Rome made calculations. It was not enough to convince. It was necessary to obtain benefits. War was costly. Provisions, road construction, legionnaire salaries, transport of supplies, construction of forts, weapons, repairs. For a province to justify its annexation, it had to repay with minerals, slaves, taxes, some form of tangible wealth. And that is where Colonia became an unsolvable problem. Despite some mineral deposits in southern Scotland, such as iron, lead, small veins of gold, Their exploitation was practically unfeasible, though the rugged terrain, constant rain, lack of infrastructure, like subscribe to the video.